So for my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the influence of an artist. That is the topic that I chose for my essay and throughout this course. Art is just something that's very personal to me. My mom's an artist, and art is just something that I've always really cared about. It was like the first thing that I really felt good at when I was a kid, and it's always just stuck with me. So I really wanted, when I had an opportunity for the class to research really in-depth a topic, I decided I wanted to learn about fellow artists and like people who have been able to influence others through art. And I really want to focus primarily on the fact that I think art is a really fascinating way of depicting the progression of time, because art is just something that's very personal. I feel like artists kind of tell the story of their generation through their work, and it's like an unspoken language of being able to depict how values and traditions and things that were seen as important kind of changes through the style of art. So when I was beginning this, I mostly focused on a few different famous artists. I looked up a few famous pieces as well, one of which was the Merry Jesters. It's from the outside eye, like that's, that hasn't really read much on it. It kind of just looks like an innocent piece that's of a jungle, has a lot of really vivid colors. It just looks kind of youthful, just kind of meant to be pretty. But what's kind of interesting is that from art analysts, they can kind of see how there's a lot of concepts that depict a certain humor, which I think is really interesting for the time, and it kind of proves my theory, because the piece was created by a friend of Picasso's, which, if you know anything about art history, Picasso was somebody that was a very extravagant person, and his time of being popular was one that was like in a time of kind of defying certain values and systems that were kind of set into place. It was more of a free time, so I think that humor was something that was really fascinating, that was like that the artist was interested in expressing through their art. I also learned a lot about Van Gogh. Van Gogh was somebody that I really learned a lot about as a kid, oddly enough. I was just very interested in art even back then. And when I was learning about Van Gogh, I knew that he struggled with mental health, just for my general background knowledge, but I didn't know that a lot of his most famous pieces actually were created when he was in a mental asylum, including The Starry Night, which I think is really interesting, because when most people think of Vincent van Gogh, that's like the first piece that they think of. And I think that what's really interesting about art, especially art such as Van Gogh's, is that it's really submersive, and that you kind of feel a sense of freedom and liberation in a piece like that. But in reality, it was made when he was restricted in an asylum. So I thought that was really interesting, that artists and it kind of also expresses my theory about the passing of time, because I think that it was really interesting representation of how he probably longed to be free and to be in beautiful places, like he was painting, even though he was really troubled and his situation was not a good one. So another thing I thought was really interesting when I was researching artists and the effect that they kind of create with telling their story about the passage of time was through an Impressionist artist. She actually created pieces in the Impressionist movement. She had a lot of Impressionist artist friends. And she actually taught her daughter her art techniques, and it became like a generational thing, which I think is really interesting. And we actually have canvases saved by her daughter as well as her, and I think it was just really interesting how art can kind of reveal time even through like our children, and it can be passed on through generations. It's something that we can learn from one another. Her name was Morrissey, and her daughter's name was Julie, and I just think it's really interesting that she ended up kind of passing down her talents and her traits to her daughter, which is a really interesting way that time moved and that time was being expressed. Another thing that I think was really interesting when I was reading a lot about it is the value that we have in art as young people, because it is now that we have the most opportunity to express ourselves through art and make a living. They're like the starving artist. That's not a really concept that exists as much today as it did years and years ago, because now we can sell our art through social media. A lot of young people are especially hustling with this, and I think it's just really interesting that now we have so many platforms that we can sell our art on. We have such a wider audience of people who can look at our art and be interested in our art. And I think that it's also interesting. I read a lot about how artists are influenced by other artists as well. Kanye West actually learned from a fellow artist from his piece Sleep, and he pulled a lot of inspiration for that into his music video Famous, which not being interested in art like that, I still think it's kind of interesting that like my generation, when they think about artists, they normally think about like musicians or people like Kanye, and then Kanye actually pulled inspiration from another artist. And what's extra interesting is that the artist actually was very honored to kind of be paid tribute to, and he described Kanye's video as bold. And yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, that artists can learn through other artists. It's another example of time passing as well, is that it's kind of handed down from generation to the next generation. Another thing I think is really interesting is that art kind of tells the story of like where we come from. One example of this is that there is an artist, let me just recall his name very quickly. Let's see. Oh, Rockwell, yes. He actually initially in his work was using models for his artwork, but then he actually started pulling in his neighbors, his friends, his family, and using them as models for his depictions in his pieces, which I think is really interesting. I apologize, it's getting kind of dark behind me, but I live with my family, so it's really hard for me to be able to film where it's quiet, that's not outside, so I'm very sorry about that. But yeah, I think that's really interesting too, that it's like they can physically see when they come and visit, like friends and stuff, they can see the time passing through, you know, generations of like them knowing certain neighbors that may be passed on when they're viewing this artwork, and it's just a very real representation of time passing. So yeah, those are some of the things that I learned in this project, and yeah, that's my presentation.